want to thank M+ invited me here to share some kind of thoughts I have had in the recent years. And actually, my talk is not about 1980s, but about the previous 2 decades. And I think it's the art of that time set a foundation for the later the art developed in the 1980s. The late years of the Cold War, particularly in the 1970s, established distinctive local approaches to art in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China. The three were situated in a completely different social, political, and economic context during this period. In Hong Kong, modernist art appearing in the 1960s and 1970s as the post-colonial era yielded a new approach that stimulated the birth of the local Hong Kong consciousness in the last British colony in Asia. The short-lived boom of the modern art in 1960 Taiwan was set back in the 1970s by the complicated political response to the global situation, including the growing economy, along with the loss of the representation in the UN. Meanwhile, the mainland was in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, almost completely cut off from the outside world and taking its socialist, realist propaganda art to the extreme. However, the earth-shaking changes will soon appear in the larger world, based on small cracks in the established structure that could be traced back for decades. Taiwan and Hong Kong are different in many fundamental ways, from spoken dialect to the colonial history. Nevertheless, they shared a common historical characteristic: lengthy and thorough subjugation to colonial rule, and between 1949 and 1979, a common cultural orientation to Western Europe and the US. It was their position in relationship to the West, that is a non-communist world, rather than the East, the communist bloc, that brought their artward into alignment with one another by the 1970s, and made possible the significant role they played in the modernization of the mainland China's artwork in the 1980s. For the first 10 years or 15 years after establishment of the PRC, the Hong Kong artwork saw both the influx of fellow Cantonese artists whose work was generally in tones of their own, and the new arrivals who brought with their trends from the artwork of Shanghai and Nanjing, and also the Beijing. In the absence of a more formal structure for the artistic activity, many new art clubs and groups were established in the 1950s. Many of them work in the Lin-Nan style. With the international decline of the colonialism followed the World War II, the British Empire also began to wane. To maintain the control of Hong Kong under these circumstances, Britain required a thoughtful policy towards the Chinese subjects of the colony. By the latter half of the 1950s, the British government in Hong Kong had begun to intentionally cultivate among Hong Kong residents a form of civic pride, the idea that the Hong Kong was a special place and that they therefore enjoy a unique Hong Kong identity. The Chinese Art Club, established in 1956, was perhaps the most influential of the group within the involving colonial society. It was neutral politically, at least in relationship to China, but it was originally conceived as an alternative to Hong Kong Art Club, which showed only oil and watercolors, mainly by British colonial artists. The cultural agenda of the Chinese Art Club received support from the colonial authority, and the British Council began financing their annual exhibitions and journal. In 1956, the British Council further collaborated with the Chinese Art Club to to send a traveling exhibition of Chinese painting to various cities in Southeast Asia. By the 1958, it was formally registered with the Hong Kong government, had 200 members, and also became part of the Hong Kong Arts Festival. Over the course of the 1960s, many come to accept this cultural status. Hong Kong identity has several ramifications. It serves to invest those who felt it with a great stake in the colony's success, and it divorced Hong Kong Chinese from an attachment to China. Directly supporting the growth of the Hong Kong cultural consciousness in the late 1950s and 1960s were a new educational and cultural institutions. With their promotion of the local culture and the art, then from the March to the October of 1967, the prophet slide also, I mentioned this before, a campaign of the leftist riots and terrifying violence further alienated the Hong Kong public from the Chinese regime. The conjunction of these two facts, Britain's encouragement of a positive feeling for Hong Kong and Chinese actions to inspire fear, brought Hong Kong into a distinctive cultural space. The development of the distinctive modern Hong Kong art may be, at least in part, associated with the establishment of an academic program in fine arts at the New Asia College in the late 1950s, the Xinya Shuyuan, thus introducing art into higher education. Among its other strengths, which include the study of classical Chinese art, it is significant in its first 2 decades as the locks for the development of a new abstract form of ink painting that became the particularly identifying with the Hong Kong culture. Although many of the sources of information on the modernism were available in the late 1950s, few were as direct as those who brought to the New Asia program from Paris in 1985 by Zhao Wuji. His lectures were widely published, and his passionate engagement with abstraction inspired young artists in Hong Kong. Interest in post-war forms of modernism had already begun to grow by this time. In 1956, a magazine called the Xin Wave Art and Literature, Wenyi Xingcao, was established to introduce the modernist culture and art. And the following year, the Hong Kong Artists Association, with Ri Shou-kun as a member, was formed with the same goal. In 1958, the Modern Literature and Arts Association was organized by Wu Shih-wang and William Yip and others to bring the aspiring modernist writer and artist together. A main goal of the group as a whole was to promote the Eastern from the modern art and literature in Hong Kong. They published 2 magazines. One is Xin Si Cao in 1959 and Hao Wang Jiao in 1963, and organized 3 Hong Kong International Arts Salons in 1960, 1962, and 1964. They showed modernist artwork from Hong Kong, along with those from Europe, the United States, Southeast Asia, and Taiwan. The connection between the modernist movement developing in Taiwan and Hong Kong were particularly important to both artworks in this period. Several developments within the cultural administration affected art in the early 1960s. In 1962, to promote Hong Kong art, a gallery was established in the newly constructed Hong Kong City Hall with the opening show entitled Hong Kong Art Today. Establishment of such authoritative venue made it possible to effect a change in art direction. The gallery's first director, John Warner, emphasized the experimentation and creativity, including the new use of the media, and as the criteria for the selection of works. Modernism now had both a venue and an increasingly mainstream position. The increasingly abstract new ink art, which combined up-to-date Western abstract expressionists with the traditional Asian materials, was warmly welcomed in the new City Hall Art Gallery, as in the university programs. Although abstract ink art was not initially claimed by its artists to be a sign of Hong Kong culture, and indeed was more often discussed by them in reference to the Asian philosophy and Eastern Dongfang aesthetics. The curator critics who determined its position in the artistic canon eventually discussed it in terms of Hong Kong identity. This art, neither British or the Chinese, was promoted in a way that suggests the independent culture that was of particular necessity beyond the nation state. In the 1970s, Hong Kong became one of the most important cities of Asia, and indeed of the capitalist world, one that took pride in its prosperity, sense of order, rationality, practicality, peace, and freedom. The rise of new ink art as a sign of Hong Kong's identity was thus supported by economic and civic developments. The sense of security was eventually superiority was shattered, however, when the negotiation between Britain and China about the future of Hong Kong began in 1979. The fragility of the Hong Kong identity, which was based most fundamentally on the assumption of Hong Kong's stability, was exposed. For the artist, these changes parallel to the world art trends, and particularly the shift in the artistic mainstream from the modernism to the postmodernism. As in Hong Kong, Taiwan saw a flood of the refugees arrived from the mainland China after the communist victory, initially believing that this exile would be temporary. When the government of the Republic of China began its retreat from the communists on the mainland in 1948, significantly, however, the government in exile retained the diplomatic recognition of the most nations of the Western world, and its seat at the UN is in discourse of the Cold War. It was Free China. The most important artistic and cultural trends promoted by authority in the period between 1949 and the middle of 1990s were aimed to identify the nationalist government with the preservation of and the restoration of China's classical culture as the de facto cultural symbol of the nationalist government. In addition to the ink painters, Taiwan's artwork was also stimulated by the arrival of the oil painter with the new idea. This is Li Zhongsheng. In his private studio, Li Zhongsheng's private studio in the early 1950s, he quickly attracted a group of aspiring young artists whose mind he filled with the call for freedom, originality, and creativity. This laid the groundwork for a modernist revolt against the cultural orthodoxy in the middle of 1950s. In the year of 1970, we saw the establishment of the two modernist painting societies, the Fifth Simon Painting Society and the Eastern Painting Society, 五月画会、东方画会. The Fifth Simon Painting Society was established by graduates from provincial the Normal College. The group supported in their efforts by the novelists, musicians, and the poets argued vigorously in print, in debate, and the most importantly, with their own works of art. That only this form of art that could be considered modern was abstract. The Eastern Painting Society was comprised of many Li Zhongsheng's young students, and it included a mixture of the teachers and their young soldiers. Their polemics was all the more controversial because of the effective discourse with which they articulated their artistic theories and their challenge to both conservatism of the provincial exhibition and the dominance of Japanese style painting. Unlike the mainland Chinese artists in the 1950s, the iconoclasts in Taiwan were free to write and speak about art, but they still had no exhibition venue and they garnered no institutional support for their artistic activities. As a result, they looked abroad for validation, successfully submitting their works to the Sapporo the Biennial and the Paris Young Youth Biennials. In 1960, these two groups were among the 17 non-mainstream painting organizations were brought together under the umbrella of the newly established Chinese Modern Art Center. In 1964, pop artist Rosenberg won the prize at the Venice Biennial. The following year in Taiwan, a key supporter for the abstract movement, the Cultural Magazine and the Gallery Wenxin closed its priority went to bankruptcy. Many young Taiwanese modernists left for the West, thinning the modernist ranks. The abstract expressionists reached the height of their achievement in 1960s and 1970s, breaking down the boundary between the Asian art and the Western art and creating means of the expression that both modern and Chinese. The 1970s and the 1980s were a time of increasing prosperity in Taiwan, but were also the period during which the Taiwanese art world and the society suffered a number of shocks. First, in 1972, the PRC was recognized as legitimate government of China and took Taiwan's seats in the UN. The U.S. formally dropped the diplomatic relations with the IOC at the end of 1978. Jiang Jingguo, who served as president until his death in 1988, initiated major economic developments, gradually relaxed the control on political speech and organizations, and in 1987 lifted the martial law. As it became clear that Taiwan was intentionally isolated, the Taiwan as a cultural world responded with the profound rethinking of its identity and the local culture. The 1970s and 1980s were thus characterized as the era of developing native consciousness. Some of them you just heard from Mr. You's talk. Although the nature of the colonial experience in Taiwan and Hong Kong were different in many spaces, by 1990 they shared certain general characteristics. Both societies had been very dramatically changed by their colonial experience. At the same time, their practical separation from China, particularly between 1959 and the 1980s, had produced a cultural and a psychological separation as well. Meanwhile, the second half of the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s, the mainland China was in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, almost completely cut off from the outside world, and taking its socialist realist propaganda art to extremes. This period conclusively broke the transmission of China's traditional art of ink painting, which was endangered by the force of the westernization in the preceding Republican period, and then further attacked in the early years of the PRC. China's art historical heritage was replaced by one engineered for the purpose, a form of the socialist realism that was modified in accord with the narrow definition of Chinese folk tastes. Yet that remained, regardless whether executed in oil or ink, essentially Western in its conception. This systematic remaking of the nation's visual aesthetic was accelerated as the unprecedented number of the young people were recruited into the visual and the performing arts, yielded extremely large and strong cohort of Chinese artists. Almost all of them are trained in the uniform and often bombastic official style designed to represent China as a highly centralized socialist state. Even under this difficult condition, some young artists stood up against the ideological premise colonized in the first 30 years of PRC, that art must serve the state, instead of the required art of social realism with its artificially optimistic image of ever-smiling workers and peasants. The Wuming group of the artists of Beijing sought a realm of freedom in the beauty of nature. Such subject matter was entirely apolitical, but in a repressive era, what one refused to say was far more conspicuous than what one said. To be apolitical was too decent. It was perhaps only in this very peculiar environment that the radical landscape could be and would be read as courageous, even foolhardy attack on the dictator and his art. The star painting group, also from Beijing, were brought together for the purpose of an artistically and politically provocative exhibition in 1979, and become the notorious for handing their exhibition on the fence of outside the Chinese National Art Gallery on September 27, 1979. Many of their work, many of their members involved in the underground poetry and literature during the Cultural Revolution and had formed circles of literature friends. Their existence as an art group lasted for only 2 years, 1979 and 1980, and was intimately tied to the democracy war movement. Both Wuming and the stars might be seen as the inheritors of the new cultural movement of 1910s, when the reformist writer who considered the modernization and westernization to be the two sides of the same coin sought to liberate China from its feudal past. These two Beijing groups rather naturally graduate to the Western cultural form, such as the free verse poetry, classical music, film, and theater, and in art to oil painting, prints, and sculpture. They sought the artistic truth in the authenticity of human desire, pain, and dreams, and explored the personal means of the creativity and asserted the value of the individual. In the process, they demonstrated an alternative to the closed aesthetic and political system of the socialist realism, and laid the groundwork for Chinese art to emerge from its self-imposed isolation. During the second half of the 1980s, as the Cold War was beginning to wind down, we see the dramatic appearance of the modernist art in mainland China. The gradual softening in the communist bloc countries that suddenly concluded with the end of the Cold War in 1989, threw all three quite divergent artworks into a common global environment. All these distinctive local features changed after the Cold War finished, but during the new era, their legacy left an impact on the development of contemporary art. Thank you very much.